Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, let's just jump right in. We're going to dive into something that I think is probably affecting every single one of us in some way right now, even if we haven't really realized it yet.
I think you're right.
I'm talking about global trade. It's kind of a mess right now. A real tariff storm has been brewing and seems to just keep getting worse.
Yeah. April 8th, 2025. I
Yeah.
think we should all kind of mark that date on the calendar.
Why April 8th?
Well, because that's when things really seem to take a turn. How goods move across borders, it all just started changing.
Yeah, it feels like almost overnight prices on certain things just went up. My grocery bill definitely feels heavier.
Right. And it's not just about, feeling it in your wallet. These tariffs are changing how entire supply chains operate. Industries all over the world, they're having to adapt. And that often means higher costs for consumers. Like you said, those higher grocery bills or the new phone you've been wanting. It's all connected.
So that's really what we want to explore today. Why are prices going up? What are tariffs? And what do they really mean for how things get made, how they're transported, and ultimately how much we end up paying for them?
Yeah, good questions. And thankfully, we've got a ton of reports data and even firsthand accounts to really help us break this all down.
Awesome. Well, let's dive in. Now, I know we've talked about trade wars in the past,
We have.
but something feels different this time.
It is different. It's not a one-way street anymore.
What do you mean?
Well, in the past, you often had, one country imposing tariffs and another one retaliating, kind of a back and forth. But this time, it's everyone. Every major player on the global stage is putting up tariff walls. It's really multi-directional, and that just amplifies the impact.
Yeah, I can see how that would make things so much more complicated.
Exactly.
And it's not just theoretical, is it? This is having real consequences for real people. One of the reports we looked at talked about huge backups at the Laredo border crossing. I mean, that's the busiest land port in North America, right?
It is, and the situation there is really dire.
Yeah, they quoted a truck driver, Manuel Ortiz. He's been crossing that border for over 20 years, and he said he's, quote, never seen it this bad, not even during COVID.
Wow. That's really powerful. It just underscores that this isn't just about numbers and policies. Real people's livelihoods are being affected. Their jobs, their ability to provide for their families, it's all on the line.
Okay, so we've been throwing around this word tariff, but I think it's worth pausing for a second to make sure everyone understands what we're talking about.
Definitely. It's a basic term, but there's a lot of misunderstanding about what it actually means.
So can you give us the simplest explanation possible?
Sure. A tariff is basically a tax.
Okay, a tax on what?
A tax on goods that are imported into a country.
Okay, so if I buy a sweater that was made in Italy,
Right, and you're in the U.S.
then a tariff would be like an extra tax I have to pay on top of the price of the sweater because it was made in another country.
You got it.
Okay. But I think the big misconception is that the Italian government would be paying that tax.
All right, that's a really common misunderstanding. The Italian government doesn't pay the tariff. It's the American company that imported the sweater that pays it.
And then they just pass that cost on to me.
Most likely, yes.
So if the U.S. government decides to put let's say, a 25% tariff on electronics coming from China,
Okay.
the American company that brings in those smartphones or laptops or whatever has to pay an extra 25% of the value of those goods to the U.S. government.
Exactly.
And of course, they're not just going to absorb that cost themselves.
No, they're going to raise their prices to cover it. So ultimately, it's you, the consumer, who ends up paying more.
So that's the basic mechanics of it.
Yeah, and it seems simple enough on the surface.
But it's actually really complicated, especially when you start talking about retaliatory tariffs and all the different countries involved.
It's a web, a really tangled web of policies and countermeasures. And to understand how we got here, I think it's helpful to take a step back and look at some key moments in trade history.
Okay, you're the history buff, so take us back in time. Where should we start?
Well, one of the most dramatic examples of tariffs gone wrong is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930.
Yeah, that one always comes up in economics classes. Wasn't that the one that made the Great Depression even worse?
It was a major contributing factor. Essentially, the U.S. decided to slap huge tariffs on thousands of imported goods.
And what happened?
But other countries retaliated with their own tariffs. Global trade absolutely plummeted, something like 66%. It just collapsed. And that had a devastating ripple effect on economies all over the world.
Wow. So that's a pretty clear example of how tariffs can backfire.
It is. Now, thankfully, our economies are a little bit more resilient today than they were back in the 1930s.
So we probably wouldn't see such a catastrophic collapse.
Hopefully not. But that doesn't mean we're immune to the negative effects of tariffs.
Right. Okay, so we got the cautionary tale of Smoot-Hawley. what other historical examples are relevant to what's happening today?
Well, if we fast forward to the period after World War II, there was a real push to reduce trade barriers and promote global cooperation. You had the creation of something called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or ATT.
VTT. Right, I've heard of that.
And GATT led to a series of negotiations that gradually lowered tariffs around the world.
Mm.
And that era of freer trade really coincided with a period of incredible economic growth.
So basically, the takeaway there is that lower tariffs generally lead to greater prosperity.
That seems to be the historical trend.
Okay, and then of course, more recently, we had the US-China trade war.
Yeah, that one started in 2018 and went on for a couple of years. And I think that was a real wake-up call for a lot of businesses.
Yeah.
They started to see just how vulnerable their supply chains were to sudden changes in trade policy.
Right, because even though it was primarily between the US and China,
Yeah,
companies all over the world felt the impact.
they did.
And that brings us to today, 2025. The tariff storm that's really unlike anything we've seen before.
It is unprecedented in its scope.
So let's get into the specifics. Who's doing what? Who's putting up tariffs against whom?
Okay, well, the U.S. has definitely been one of the most active players.
How so?
Well, they've put a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum coming from a whole bunch of countries.
Okay, and steel and aluminum, those are pretty key materials for a lot of industry.
Absolutely everything from construction to manufacturing.
So that's going to have a ripple effect.
Definitely. And then there's the new tariffs on small packages.
What do you mean by small packages?
Well, basically anything under $800 that you might order online.
Oh, wow. So like clothes from Shine or Temu.
Exactly. Those were previously exempt from tariffs, but as of May 2nd, that exemption is gone. Now it's a 30% tariff or potentially a minimum fee of $25 per item, which is set to jump to $50 in June.
So all those cheap goods from overseas are going to get a lot more expensive.
They are.
Okay, so that's the U.S. side of things. How is China responding?
Well, they've hit back pretty hard. They put retaliatory tariffs on some major U.S. agricultural exports like soybeans and pork.
Oh, so that's going to hurt American farmers.
It already is. It's estimated they've lost billions of dollars in export opportunities.
Wow.
And then there's the 25% tariff China has put on cars imported from the U.S., and they haven't stopped there. They've also targeted U.S. energy exports like crude oil, and they've restricted exports of rare earth minerals.
Earth minerals.
Yeah, those are essential for making all sorts of electronics.
So it's kind of a strategic move.
It is. They're hitting back at key industries.
So we got the U.S. and China. What about our neighbors?
Well, Canada has imposed some pretty hefty counter tariffs of their own.
How hefty are we talking?
25% on $30 billion worth of U.S. goods. Things like steel, aluminum, agricultural products, and consumer goods.
Wow.
And they're not just doing tariffs. They've also ramped up their border inspections, which is causing delays.
And it's a similar story with Mexico.
Yeah, they've imposed tariffs too, ranging from 5 to 20% on various U.S. goods. Things like pork, cheese, apples, potatoes.
So our grocery bills are going up on both sides of the border.
Pretty much, yeah. And Mexico has also implemented new border verification procedures that are slowing things down by as much as 40 to 60%.
Okay, and then what about Europe? How are they playing this?
Well, they haven't gone quite as far as the U.S. or China, but they've definitely made some strategic moves.
Like what?
They've put tariffs on some very American products like bourbon and Harley-Davidson motorcycles, kind of symbolic targets.
Okay.
And they've also implemented digital services taxes that affect U.S. tech giants like Google and Amazon.
And they're hitting back on the steel and aluminum front, too.
Yeah, they have their own countermeasures in place.
So it's really a global web of tariffs. Everyone's doing it. Now I want to focus in on the trucking industry because they're right on the front lines of all this.
They are. And they're getting squeezed from all sides.
How so?
Well, first of all, their costs are way up. The price of a new truck has jumped by like 40 grand in the past couple of years.
40 grand, seriously?
Yep. Because of the tariffs on steel and aluminum, the electronics that go into those trucks, it's all more expensive.
So that's a huge upfront cost.
And then there's the cost of maintenance. Parts are harder to get, and when you can find them, they're more expensive too.
Right, and then fuel prices are all over the place.
They are. All the tariffs on energy are making the market super volatile. One week diesel's up, the next week it's down. It's impossible to predict.
So trucking companies just can't catch a break.
No. And then there's the issue of volume.
You mean how much they're hauling?
Yeah. It's really unpredictable now.
How so?
Well, because of all the tariffs, companies are scrambling to adjust their supply chains. So you might have a carrier who's used to doing a lot of cross-border business with Mexico.
Okay.
And suddenly that business dries up because their client decides to source their products from somewhere else to avoid the tariffs.
So they lose a huge chunk of their revenue.
Overnight, practically.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they might see a surge in demand for domestic short-haul routes as companies try to source more stuff locally.
So it's just chaos.
It's a roller coaster. And then, of course, there are the border delays, which are just getting worse.
Yeah, we talked about Laredo, but it's happening everywhere.
It is. Major crossings like Buffalo, Niagara, Detroit, Windsor, they're all backed up. More paperwork, more inspections, longer wait times. It's a mess.
And all of this is putting a lot of pressure on trucking companies.
It is. Especially the smaller operators.
Yeah, the ones with really thin margins.
Exactly. I saw a survey that said something like 22% of small carriers are thinking about shutting down if things don't improve.
Yeah, that's scary.
It is. And it's not just about the numbers. These are real people's livelihoods we're talking about.
Okay, so we've talked about the direct impact on the trucking industry, but this tariff thing goes so much deeper than that, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
It's not just about trucks and borders. It's about how the entire global economy works.
And this is where the idea of the tariff cascade comes in, right?
Exactly.
Can you break that down for us?
Sure. Basically, it means that the impact of a tariff doesn't stop with the initial importer. It ripples through the entire supply chain.
Okay, give us an example.
Let's say the U.S. puts a 25% tariff on steel.
Yeah.
So the steel mill that's exporting the steel now has to charge the U.S. importer 25% more.
Right.
But then that importer is probably selling that steel to a manufacturer who's using it to make something like a refrigerator.
Okay.
So the refrigerator manufacturer's costs go up. Maybe not by the full 25%, but by a significant amount. And then they have to raise their prices to the wholesaler, who raises their prices to the retailer, who raises their prices to you, the consumer.
So that initial 25% tariff on steel might end up being like a 5% increase on the price of a refrigerator?
Something like that, yeah. And it's not just the price of the product itself. It's also the transportation costs. Trucks are more expensive, fuel's more expensive, so getting that refrigerator from the factory to the store costs more too.
So it's this ripple effect that touches everything.
It does. And it can also lead to a decrease in overall demand.
How so?
Well, if prices are going up across the board, people are going to be more hesitant to buy things.
Right, they're going to tighten their belts.
Exactly. And that means fewer goods being produced, fewer goods being shipped, and less demand for trucking services overall.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is.
Okay, so we've talked about the general impact, but let's zoom in on some specific industries. One that our sources highlighted was the auto industry.
Yeah, that's a really good example of how complex and interconnected global supply chains are and how fragile they can be.
Right, because even if a car is assembled in the U.S.,
Yeah,
the parts might come from all over the world.
exactly. And each of those parts might be subject to different tariffs depending on where it came from.
So it's a logistical nightmare.
It is. And it's costing companies a fortune.
In what way?
Well, they have to hire more people just to navigate all the different tariff codes and regulations. And they have to deal with longer lead times because parts are taking longer to get across borders.
So it's slowing down production.
It is. And then there are the delays caused by inspections at the border. So it's just a constant struggle to keep the assembly lines running. And ultimately, it all adds up to higher prices for consumers.
And then there's the impact on jobs.
Yeah. When production slows down, people get laid off. And that has a ripple effect on entire communities.
Okay, so the auto industry is a good example of how tariffs can disrupt a really complex global supply chain. What about an industry that's a little bit more straightforward?
Well, agriculture is a good one to look at. And the impact there has been really devastating.
For U.S. farmers in particular.
Yeah, especially those who rely on exports to China.
Right, because China put those retaliatory tariffs on soybeans and pork.
They did. And it's cost American farmers billions of dollars in lost sales. And a lot of that business has shifted to other countries.
Like Brazil and Argentina.
Yeah. So it's not just a loss for the farmers. It's a loss for the entire U.S. agricultural sector.
And it has implications for trucking companies, too.
Definitely. Less agricultural products being shipped means less demand for trucks.
Okay, so a lot of bad news so far. But our sources did mention one potential bright spot, which is the closure of the de minimis loophole.
Yeah, that's an interesting development.
Can you remind us what that loophole was all about?
Sure. Basically, it allowed packages worth less than $800 to enter the U.S. without paying any import duties.
Ah, so that's how companies like Shein and Temu could sell clothes so cheaply.
Exactly. They were exploiting that loophole to undercut domestic retailers
But now that loophole is closed.
as of May 2nd.
So what does that mean?
Well, those cheap imports are going to get more expensive. Either they'll have to pay the 30% tariff or the minimum fee per item.
So it's a win for domestic companies.
Potentially, yeah.
Mhm.
It could level the playing field and make U.S.-made goods more competitive.
And maybe it'll encourage people to buy less cheap disposable stuff.
That's the hope. Of course, it also means that consumers are probably going to pay more for certain things.
Right. There's no such thing as a free lunch.
But it could also be a win for domestic trucking companies.
How so?
Well, if more goods are being produced and sold within the U.S.,
Okay.
that means more demand for domestic trucking services.
Interesting. So it's kind of a mixed bag.
It is. There are winners and losers.
Okay, so we've talked about North America. What about other parts of the world? How are they adapting to this new tariff landscape?
Well, in Asia, a lot of companies are moving their manufacturing operations out of China.
To avoid the tariffs.
Exactly. They're shifting production to countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, places that aren't subject to the same tariffs.
Ah, so it's like they're playing a game of tariff arbitrage.
They are. They're
Ah.
trying to find the cheapest path to get their goods to market. And that's creating all sorts of new shipping patterns, which is something that trucking companies have to adapt to.
Okay, and then what about Europe? How are they handling this?
Well, they're in a tough spot. They've got close economic ties to both the U.S. and China.
So they don't want to alienate either one.
Exactly. So they're trying to walk a fine line. They're putting up some targeted tariffs, but they're also trying to keep trade flowing as much as possible.
And that means a lot more complexity for European trucking companies.
Yeah, they're dealing with a lot more paperwork and bureaucracy.
Okay, and then what about those emerging markets you mentioned earlier?
For some of them, this could actually be an opportunity.
How so?
Well, as companies move their manufacturing out of China, they're looking for new places to go. And countries like Mexico, Vietnam, India, they're all eager to attract that investment.
So they could see a boom in their manufacturing sectors.
They could. And that would mean more demand for trucking services.
Okay, so for trucking companies trying to navigate this really choppy environment, what advice would you give them?
Well, first and foremost, they need to get really good at understanding customs regulations.
Because it's so much more complicated now.
Way more complicated. Every country has its own rules, and those rules are constantly changing.
So you really need to have experts on staff who can keep up with all of that.
Absolutely. And trucking companies also need to be able to provide their clients with a lot more visibility into their supply chains.
What do you mean?
Well, shippers want to know where their goods are at all times,
Okay.
and they want to be able to track them in real time. So trucking companies need to invest in technology that can provide that level of transparency.
Okay. And then geographic diversification is probably a good idea too?
Yeah, you don't want to have all your eggs in one basket if you're too reliant on one particular trade lane.
And that trade lane gets hit with tariffs.
Right. Then you're in trouble. So you need to spread your risk.
And of course, technology is key.
It is. Trucking companies that are slow to adopt new technologies are going to get left behind.
Right. They need to be able to optimize their routes, manage their fleets, track their shipments, all that stuff.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of contracts.
Between trucking companies and their clients.
Yeah. The old way of doing things with fixed rates and long-term contracts, it just doesn't work in this environment.
Because everything's so volatile.
It is. So trucking companies need to be more flexible. They need to be able to adjust their pricing and their service offerings on the fly.
Okay, so we've talked about the current state of things. Now I want to look ahead. What are some of the possible scenarios that could play out in the future?
Well, honestly, it's really hard to say. It's a very dynamic situation. But here are a few possibilities.
Okay.
One scenario is that things just keep escalating,
Like a full-blown trade war?
potentially.
Uh-huh.
And that could have really dire consequences for the global economy. You can see a recession, job losses, all sorts of negative impacts.
Okay, not a good scenario.
No. Another possibility is that things kind of stabilize where they are now.
So tariffs stay high, but they don't get any worse.
Right. And that would give businesses time to adjust.
Mm-hmm.
They could reconfigure their supply chains, find new sources of materials, all that stuff.
So kind of a new normal.
Yeah. And then the third scenario is that things actually start to improve.
Like tariffs start coming down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe countries start negotiating new trade deals that are more favorable to everyone.
Okay, that would be the best case scenario.
It would be. But I'm not sure how likely it is.
So you're thinking it's probably going to be somewhere between the first two scenarios.
Right.
So continued uncertainty and volatility.
I think so.
Okay, well, that's not exactly comforting, but it's good to be prepared. And I think the big takeaway from all this is that tariffs have real consequences for real people.
Absolutely.
It's not just an abstract economic concept.
It's about people's jobs,
Mm.
their livelihoods, their ability to provide for their families.
One of our sources quoted a truck driver named Miguel Sanchez who said, I'm quoting here, "Politicians think they're hurting other countries with these tariffs, but they're hurting us too.
Yeah,
I'm hauling half the loads I was last year and paying more for everything."
that says it all.
It does. Well, this has been a really fascinating and honestly kind of concerning deep dive into the world of tariffs and global trade.
It's complex.
It is, but I think it's important to understand what's happening because it's affecting all of us.
And it will continue to.
So as we wrap up, here's a question for all of you listening. How do you think these changes in global trade are going to affect your life in the coming months and years? What adjustments are you going to have to make? Because one thing's for sure, the world is changing and we all need to be ready to adapt.
We do.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.